Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, wherever you are tuning in from, and welcome to Eval Cafe. My name is John Akwete. I am the coordinator for Eval Cafe here at the Evaluation Center at Western Michigan University, and I'll be your host for today. Though we are tuning in virtually, we would like to recognize that Western Michigan University is located on land historically occupied by Ojawi, Odawa, and Boduwami nations. Please take a moment to acknowledge and honor these ancestral land of the Three Fire Confederacies and consider the sacred land of all indigenous people and their continuous presence, especially where you may be tuning in from. The Evaluation Cafe is a weekly series presented throughout the academic year that features guest speakers on a wide range of evaluation topics, as evident in all our presentations last semester, and has been taking place at the Evaluation Center since the early 1980s. Though this has traditionally been a small in-person gathering that has been recorded and shared continuously from last semester, this spring 2022 speaker series, while some may be hybrid, all events will be open to the public to join online, regardless of location. For our fourth event this semester, we are delighted to be joined by our distinguished guests, Dr. Michael Quinn-Patton and Dr. Charmaine E. Campbell. Dr. Michael Quinn-Patton, he's the founder and director of Utilization-Focused Evaluation, and Dr. Charmaine Campbell, she's the director of Organizational Learning and Evaluation. Before handing over to our guests, for those new to Evaluation Cafe, we typically have 30 to 40 minutes presentation, followed by 15 to 20 minutes Q&A. Like our previous event, our guests have requested that participants submit their questions in the chat box at any point so they can pause every few minutes to feed questions from the audience. At this moment, I would like to invite Dr. Patton and Dr. Campbell to share any pertinent information about themselves and continue with the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Appreciate your hosting us, and welcome everyone. We welcome this opportunity to talk with you about the new 5th edition of Utilization-Focused Evaluation that Charmaine and I have done together. Charmaine is my daughter, and I've just been very thrilled to have her join me in the evaluation work that we do and in authoring this book. We began doing this a couple of years ago in revising the book and have been working together for several years. And there are now several intergenerational evaluators, people whose children have decided to become evaluators. And I think that bodes well for the profession. And Charmaine can tell you more about how she came to evaluation. I did the first edition of this book in 1978 when I was directing one of the very first evaluation methodology training programs at the University of Minnesota. It was basically a report on research that we were doing with graduate students on how evaluations were used in federal programs. It was a way to give some coherence to that doctoral training program. And we found in that first edition of the book that we did 20 case studies of major federal health evaluations and reviewed about 25 different potential factors that might have affected use, like the size of the evaluation, whether the findings were negative or positive, what kind of methods were used, the ways in which the evaluation was conducted. And we found that there were only 2 factors that really made a difference: the political context within which the evaluation took place, and what we came to call the personal factor. The personal factor has been a mainstay of utilization-focused evaluation ever since. The personal factor was whether there was some identifiable people, or even one person in many cases, who cared about the evaluation, who was interested in it, who was interested in the results. And that personal factor became one of the things that has influenced our work across those years. This was an important breakthrough in my own learning because I was trained as a sociologist. My doctorate's in sociology, and sociologists tend to focus on the roles and positions and status of people in organizations and treat the actual individuals as simply replaceable parts within roles and positions. But what we found was that roles and positions were much less important than who the people were, what they cared about, their interests, and that became the personal factor. The second edition of the book came out in 1986, and that's where we actually defined what utilization was as intended use by intended users. That had evolved from discussions with colleagues and presentations over the years of getting tighter on exactly what we meant by use. And that definition endures. The third edition of the book came out in 1987. And that was where we introduced process use. The notion that it's not just the findings that get used, but as people go through an evaluation process, they are affected by that experience. They learn about evaluation, they learn evaluative thinking, they learn how to use evaluation for their program improvements. And so process use was a major breakthrough in that third edition. The fourth edition came out in 2008, and by then evaluation had really become quite global. We introduced systems thinking and complexity into that edition and gave a lot more international and cross-cultural examples. And that brings us up to this new fifth edition, which came out just at the end of last year. And we're delighted to share with you the new and emergent directions in that book. So utilization-focused evaluation is the overall context for some of the new directions that have emerged from utilization-focused evaluation that includes developmental evaluation, principles-focused evaluation, and now blue marble evaluation. Each of those kinds of evaluation are utilization focused. So developmental evaluation is especially working with social innovators as primary intended users, people who are trying out new things to solve problems, to innovate, where they don't have a traditional predetermined goals or logic model. Principles-focused evaluation is for programs that are working in complex dynamic systems that need to be adaptable, and the turbulent environments mean they have to pivot, as has happened for the last 2 years with the pandemic. And so what they're grounded in are principles, and principles can be evaluated, whether they're meaningful to people, whether they're being adhered to, and where those principles take people. And then that gave rise to blue marble evaluation, which is about dealing with global systems transformations like the pandemic, climate emergency, food systems transformation. And so blue marble evaluation brings a global perspective to that work. We talk about each of these approaches in the new edition of utilization-focused evaluation because that remains the all-encompassing wraparound for these other approaches. So Charmaine, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Really happy to get to be with you all today to share a little bit more about our fifth edition and the approach that we take in this edition. As Michael said, this is intergenerational work. And so you see 3 generations there, my son Jasper and myself and Michael. Really trying to capture the wisdom and knowledge that Michael brings with some of the new and more emergent perspectives from myself and the incoming generation of evaluators. And The second piece that is really key to this new edition are min specs, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment, but really identifying the core pieces that have to be present for something to be called utilization-focused evaluation, and to really make that clear, because a lot of things call themselves utilization-focused evaluation that aren't, and there isn't always a great way to figure that out. And so we're really trying to make it clear what the minimum specifications for utilization-focused evaluation are. We also identify 10 principles of utilization-focused evaluation. As Michael said, principles can be evaluated, and so you can evaluate an evaluation based on these principles to determine the extent to which they're really living into a true utilization-focused evaluation. And then we also really focus on equity and sustainability and the importance of relevance to the current context, the COVID-19 pandemic, the ongoing pandemic of racism and injustice, as well as the climate crisis, and really talking about how UFE fits into that and helps to support that. So some of that blue marble perspective, but really emphasizing that all utilization-focused evaluations should bring that importance of context and relevance to the work. So we're going to talk a little bit more next about those min specs, the minimum specifications. So I'll turn it back to Michael.
We do invite you to put any questions or observations or comments into the chat as we go along. So Charmaine said minimum specifications, or min specs, really come out of complexity theory and design science, where when designing innovations, designers try to figure out what are the minimum specifications for something that they're designing. What are the things that have to be met to solve whatever the problem is, or to meet the needs of a client when designing something. This idea was brought into our work in evaluation from Brenda Zimmerman, a colleague from Canada, who with Francis Wesley, also Canadian, and I collaborated on a book called Getting to Maybe, How the World Has Changed, where we studied social movements. And Brenda had been working in complexity and brought the idea of min specs in, establishing only those very few requirements necessary to define something, leaving everything else open to the creative evolution of the complex adaptive system. So what we've identified are core elements that identify what is essential. That is, what is considered the minimum that must occur for an evaluation to be considered utilization focused. And as Charmaine said, we get lots of studies sent to us. We see them published. I get copies of dissertations and evaluations that carry the label utilization focused evaluation, but often don't meet these min specs. And so we thought it would be helpful to not just do the detailed comprehensive guide to everything, which gets really thick. And the last edition, the 4th edition of utilization focused evaluation got up to 600 pages. So we've shortened this book and are cross-referencing the new book with the material that's in the previous book. We've put a lot of the material from the 4th edition online and have focused more in this new edition on min specs and on related principles of what the utilization-focused evaluation is.
This book looks like that. It's definitely longer than one page. We weren't that concise, but yes, we do have 5 min specs that do help you get at the core. So we'll talk about what those are now. So the first min spec is honor the personal factor. Identify and engage primary users. So if you're not doing that, you're not doing utilization-focused evaluation. The second is to be purpose-driven. So that is focusing on priority intended uses. So you've got the users and the uses here. The third is to facilitate process use. be active, reactive, interactive, and adaptive in engaging users in all aspects of the evaluation. The fourth is to take a full journey stance, so focus on use from beginning to end and every step along the way. It's not something that you just do at the beginning and then you go along, go out and do your thing and come back. It's this ongoing facilitated process that really looks at it from beginning to end. And then adapt to context changes, as I said, really being aware of what's happening out in the world as well as what's happening within the program, what the context for the evaluation is. And when the context changes, the evaluation needs to change. And here's another way of visualizing or thinking about how these min specs fit together. And you've got your primary intended users and your primary intended uses. You're engaging the users and focusing on use throughout with that monitoring and adapting to context. Do you want to give any examples of this before we move into principles, or are there any questions around min specs before we move on?
Any questions? The work around the pandemic is a good example of the different primary intended users, so that evaluations are going on in schools to try to help parents and teachers figure out how to keep kids and teachers safe, while at the same time evaluations are going on in emergency rooms to figure out how to handle the overload of patients with COVID. Policymakers are engaged in evaluation of different policies around masking and social distancing, quarantining, lockdowns. So each one of these are the ways in which the different users at different levels have different information needs, and that engaging them, then one evaluation approach can't answer the questions of all those different users. And as the pandemic itself has changed and unfolded along the way, the different users and the different purposes of evaluation, helping improve the response to COVID, helping figure out how to get people vaccinated. Why is there resistance to vaccination? How to make vaccinations accessible, how to make masks accessible. Every one of those changes in dealing with the pandemic has evaluation issues involved, has people doing evaluations, and has different users, different purposes, and it keeps evolving. And utilization-focused evaluation fits that. There's a question about how equity fits in, and Charmaine has answered that equity runs through this and is one of the cross-cutting themes around the purpose. So that engaging the users, what you'll find is that we've suggested, in fact, insisted in the later part of the book that in engaging users, they should always be engaged around issues of equity and sustainability as a part of whatever other purpose evaluation is doing.
And I'm just putting in
Michael,
the
I
chat.
have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, so let's see, I think it was Shadish, Cook, and Campbell had said there were 5 different categories of theory we should be interested in as evaluators, use being one of them. Let's see, I think the others were valuing theory, knowledge construction, practice, and social programming. But I'm curious if you agree with that characterization, and if so, how use continues to relate with those other 4.
Well, thank you. It's a great question. I'm actually teaching a theory course this semester at Claremont Graduate University, and we've used in part the Shadish work, the Alkin and Christie evaluation theory tree, And the efforts for placing different theories in some kind of a framework goes on in describing what is necessary for a theory to be a theory. And I've now identified some 85 different evaluation models, approaches, and theories that are out there. The utilization piece includes, and especially in this new edition, the values of equity and sustainability as explicit cross-cutting values. So it handles that part as well as evaluation use itself. The other examples in the Shadish book tend to value things like methods to a greater extent, so that or judgment, as in Scriven's case, rendering overall judgment of merit and worth. So use is one kind of framing of that. Knowledge generation has been a huge part of our work. Since the first edition of the book, there's been a huge amount of research on use. There's probably more research on use in evaluation than virtually any other topic, including dissertations and publications around the factors related to use, the ways in which context affects use, identifying the various factors that affect use. And then the social programming piece of this is how this is useful and applicable to interventions. And I think that it's very clear that the track record of utilization-focused evaluation has proven especially relevant to nonprofits and social programs and other kinds of programs because of the emphasis on utility. So the criteria in any of those frames fit well. In the theory tree work that has been going on with some controversy, as Zach notes, is paying more attention to the social justice stream of things and indigenous forms of knowledge. I've actually, from the very beginning, been in conversation with Marv Alkin about not particularly liking the theory tree diagram or framing because it, I think, is too rigid. And for my own contributions, I don't see myself just on the use tree, the use branch. The qualitative book that I've done, which would be on the methods branch, has actually been more widely used than any of my evaluation books. The most widely used of my books across disciplines is the qualitative book. And on the values part of the tree, we have very much worked at valuing engagement and collaboration. This new edition places great emphasis on equity and sustainability as part of the social justice branch. And so while I've been one of the case examples that Alkin and Christie used, I'm not particularly happy with the rigidity of that framing. Others have tried doing a river and tributaries to classify them, but I'm working on a different kind of classification system because I don't think those do justice to the diversity of the field these days. Thanks for that question.
One more question that just popped up. Should we take that or do you want to move on and circle back?
Yeah, we can take that. The implementation science focuses on one part of the whole process. And so the main overlap in some ways is the issue of fidelity and min specs. So that when we look at the extent to which an approach has high fidelity to the model, That's what min specs are. Implementation science is paying a lot of attention to whether models get fully implemented. And the tension in implementation science is between high fidelity versus adaptability. So that things that are called, for example, best practices, expect to have very high fidelity of prescriptive implementation exactly as the model is specified. You're supposed to do it exactly the way the model says you should do it. That's in contrast to contextual adaptation. And the new book, this new book especially, comes down more on the contextual adaptation side of implementation science. And therefore, instead of prescribing detailed practices, we've taken a principles approach. Principles give you guidance, but they're not so rigid as to specify detailed practices. And so they allow for more contextual sensitivity and adaptation instead of rigid adherence to particular steps that one should take. You want to talk about this, Charmaine?
Sure. So yeah, that brings us to principles here. And the overarching principle for utilization-focused evaluation is focus on intended use by and with intended users in every aspect of and at every stage of an evaluation. And we have 10 operating principles that are kind of how you implement this overarching principle in practice. And so we'll go through each of those, and Michael, just stop me along the way if there's one you want to elaborate on, okay?
All right.
So contextualize, understand and take into account the situation in which the evaluation will occur. We've talked a lot about that already. Personalize, honor the personal factor, identify and engage with the primary intended users of the evaluation. Customize, be purpose-driven, engage with primary intended users to determine the evaluation's distinctive uses. Align, ensure conceptual alignment of evaluation questions, design, methods, and analysis with intended use by intended users. Prioritize, make attention to use the driving force of the evaluation from beginning to end. Engage users, be active, reactive, interactive, adaptive in working with and engaging intended users. Strategize process use, facilitate process use with intentionality, be aware of and strategic about how being involved with the evaluation affects those involved. Adapt, watch for, be alert to, and adapt to changing circumstances, shifting priorities, turnover among intended users, reallocation of resources, change timelines, and other factors that emerge over time to avoid blinders and rigidity. Mobilize follow-through with intended users to interpret, act on, and fully utilize the evaluation's findings. And reflect and learn. Make time and space to reflect on the strengths and weaknesses of the utilization-focused evaluation process and results so as to learn and improve. And these principles came out of what was previously steps in the Essentials of Utilization-Focused Evaluation book. There were 17 steps, I think. And what we realized as we were rewriting this was that it's really not a linear process. It's not that you do step 1 and then move on to step 2 and then step 3, but that these principles are operating throughout. Some of them kind of happen more at a certain time than others, but you can't just like check it off and move on. And so, as Michael has said, the principles provide a guiding framework for how to do this work. And this is how these things fit together. So we've got the overarching principle of focusing on intended use by and with intended users in every aspect of and at every stage of an evaluation. And then those 5 min specs are really at the core. And then the 10 operating principles can help you round out that evaluation of how you implement that overarching principle. And so this is really how you get towards that evaluation use. So you want to say more about that, Michael, at all?
The distinction between overarching and operating principles has become very important in being able to specify general guidance and more specific guidance. And it's not unlike the difference between goals and objectives, where you've got an overarching goal and then you have some specific objectives. An overarching principle provides the overarching goal, and the operating principles are like specific objectives within the overarching utilization-focused evaluation principle. So that any time that things become uncertain, then you turn back and are grounded, as this diagram shows, in that basic overarching principle. Now this sounds straightforward in some ways, focusing on intended use by and with intended users in every aspect and at every stage of an evaluation. But I see evaluations all the time, and I invite you to look for them where, in fact, it's not clear who the evaluation is for. So that I see evaluations that simply say they're done for a foundation, or they're done for the federal government, or they're done for a commission, or they're done for a funder. That's not specifying either intended use or intended users. When we're talking about specifying intended users, based upon the personal factor, that means identifiable people. I have said from the beginning, and we've reinforced in this new edition, organizations don't use information, people use information. And so the personal factor is about who is going within an organization. If it's for the legislature, which legislative committee? If it's for a foundation, which staff? Is it board members? Is it a board committee? Is it particular staff? Is it grantees? To get very clear. Or if it's often a multi-stakeholder task force of people brought together to represent different constituencies, that they are the users on behalf of other stakeholders. But you've got identifiable people who you're facilitating and working with to decide those potential uses. No evaluation on the use side can answer all possible questions. There are hundreds of questions you could ask of virtually any kind of program or intervention. So the process of focusing on what are the priority questions and who are those questions being answered for to take what kind of actions, that's the logic that's at the core of utilization-focused evaluation. And yet we still see a great many, in fact, most evaluations don't specify specifically intended use or intended users. And that's what the fidelity issue is. That's what MinSpecs are about.
Michael?
Go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, related to this personalization, customization, when you identify your audience or your users of the evaluation, then how about specific techniques in terms of then customizing, prioritizing, if you will, what questions you then should be addressing?
It's a really important question. And, we've got a whole chapter of the book about that. It's a menu approach of understanding the context, or what kind of situation is the program in, what decisions are pending, what kind of issues have arisen. Is it a new program? Are they trying out new things? Is it an established program that's wanting to adapt to a different context? Is it a program that's being expanded to different areas, to new participants, and therefore is trying to serve a different kind of audience? So it's a lot of upfront work. And in fact, part of the metaphor here that we use is farmers tilling the field. You don't just go out and throw the seed on hard ground. You have to prepare the soil. You have to plow. You have to be sure that the soil has the proper nutrients. And so the upfront work we do is typically with a beginning workshop for the primary intended users, a multi-stakeholder group, that comes together, and we consider options about the kind of questions they might want to ask, and why those questions would be important, and narrowing it down, given the resources and the timelines that people have, what's going to be the priority questions. Over time, new issues may arise, as in the pandemic, and that's why one of the principles is to be adaptable, that the questions that seemed important at the beginning may become less important as conditions change, and as new issues arise. So that the way in which you stay in touch with the context of what's happening in a program becomes a big part of not just deciding questions at the beginning, putting them in stone and thinking you're not going to revisit that. The last 2 years have been a good example of that, not just because of the pandemic. Charmaine and I are coming to you from Minnesota, where George Floyd was murdered, and the social justice uprising around the world, the efforts at changing systems of structural racism has changed how programs are approaching those issues, and evaluators have had to adapt to those changing emphases, including the book, which places that greater emphasis on equity out of those kinds of events.
Thank you.
Audette says, Etienne Audette says, working for the government, we'd always know if our primary client is the general public or the people running the program we evaluate or managers. I think, the point here is that that's one of the weaknesses of some government programs, is that it pretends that there's a generic approach to evaluation, so that the general public is not general. It's made up of lots of different publics. There's no there. And the people running programs have different needs. Managers have different needs. So a lot of government evaluation is actually for accountability, not for the general public, but for the people who make the laws. It's for the legislature to give the appearance of accountability to the general public. And that's part of what has to get clear, is to be doing the evaluation in a way that whether or not it's for learning purposes or if it's for accountability purposes. If it's for, some government programs are trying to come up with models. Some are trying to serve new audiences and find out how they can better meet the needs of people. So those are different purposes, and being clear about that applies to the government as much as it does to any place else. That's part of our point. One of the things that reduces use in government funding is not being clear about who the evaluation is for, thinking that one size fits all. And so we push this point. I do a lot of government evaluation. Charmaine works with governments. We do some of that together. And so when we're working with government units, we take a utilization-focused evaluation perspective and push for clarity about who are the priority users, even in that public sector event. Want to go ahead, Charmaine?
I do. There's one other question about up a little bit farther about the working within a project constraints timelines. It's very hard to keep all stakeholders engaged at all times. Engaging them at different points is considered as context adaptation. And I do think that, thinking about ongoing engagement, it's not like you're talking about every day, or, you're thinking about specific touch points, decision points, and who those primary intended users are versus kind of a broader umbrella of stakeholders. There will be different levels of engagement. There will be people who need to be brought in who are new. And so it is an ongoing process, but it doesn't have to be at all times. So I would say that some of it is context adaptation, particularly when there are new stakeholders that need to be brought in, but it's also thinking about being strategic about when decisions are being made, when information is going to be available, and how that process will unfold. And that can be co-created with those primary intended users. So yes, it's time consuming and challenging, but there are ways to do it that can, really move the process along more fluidly than when you really, when you think about having to do it with very specific people at very specific times and continuing to adapt as you go. You want to say anything more about that, Michael, before we move on?
Just to add to your response to Juna's question, and thanks for being here, Juna. Nice to hear from you. The steps and the principles are not in conflict with each other. They just serve different kinds of use needs. People can be helped by having a set of concrete steps to follow. But one of the downsides I found with the steps is that they've gotten interpreted as more rigid, and the checklist has gotten interpreted as more rigid than was intended. There was recently an article in the American Journal of Evaluation about advocacy evaluation that said that it wasn't utilization-focused evaluation because there were too many steps. And they couldn't follow all the steps in the rapidly changing environment of advocacy. Well, it's not meant to be a kind of rigid straitjacket that you have to move through all of those steps. That was an effort to look at a comprehensive frame of the steps you'd go through in a major evaluation, but there are shorter term evaluations where you come in the middle, where there's already a theory of change, where you already have the stakeholders identified, and you may enter later in the steps, not begin that process over again. So we see them as complementary. We haven't repeated the steps in the new edition because we've made them available online rather than go through them and include that checklist again. So in a way, it's working back and forth between the principles and the steps, depending on how much concreteness you need at any moment in the process.
So we'll end with this attention to the new emergent and urgent directions. This is the part 3 of the book and really the newest part, and comes back to that frame of equity and sustainability. We talk about the high stakes of evaluative thinking and reality testing, particularly in our current climate, where truth is seen as, we're in sort of a post-truth era. What does that mean? The importance of really engaging in evaluative thinking and that process of challenging our assumptions. We look at utilization-focused evaluation's role in that context and in really trying to elevate the importance of evaluative thinking and challenging where information comes from and what is considered truth. Then in our next chapter, chapter 18, we make the case that evaluation can and should be used to contribute to a more equitable and sustainable world. We know we're not the first to be doing that. The chapter is informed by many colleagues, Nikki Bowman, Donna Mertens, Karen Kirkhart, Bob Stake, Rodney Hobson, so many others. And so this is kind of where we think about that theory tree again, and knowing that we aren't just on that one branch of use, but that they are connected. So we try to situate utilization-focused evaluation within the global context of the climate crisis and exacerbating inequalities, and really offer UFE as part of that solution. And so, utilization-focused evaluation, you don't see equity and sustainability in the principles and in the min specs, because you can have a utilization-focused evaluation that doesn't include those, but we are making a value statement that they should, and that if the primary intended user is not interested in those, it becomes a dialogue between the evaluator and the intended users about the relevance and importance of those things. So sometimes it means the evaluator bringing those to the table and determining the extent to which that is going to be part of the use. So it's co-created. It's not just saying like whatever you want to do, but really trying to push people's thinking along those lines. And then we look at the clarion call for evaluation transformation. And so I'm going to turn over to Michael to talk about that because he is steeped in the transformation field as it emerges. So go ahead, Michael.
Well, let me incorporate Sabina's question into this. She's asking, how can we advocate for evaluation for learning, for transformation in public systems? And the increasingly, we're seeing, because of things like the pandemic, because of hunger, because of climate change, that the public sector is realizing the need for major policy change, for major systems change, for structural kinds of changes. And part of what we've argued in the book and in other writings is that the traditional ways of doing evaluation can actually be a barrier to change, including in the public sector, because it is rigid and based upon narrowly predetermined goals, closed systems, logic models, where accountability to a predetermined course and predetermined goals is the focus of evaluation for accountability. And in a project way of thinking, getting projects and programs done, whereas transformation and our field is moving towards changing systems. And systems are different than projects and programs. When you're talking about changing structural racism or the ways in which our consumer and capitalist society is contributing to climate change, the issues around structural issues around poverty, the sustainable development goals worldwide. These are about systems change rather than doing projects and programs. And increasingly, we're going to be seeing and are seeing in parts of the public sector attention to systems change. So it means that what these new and emergent and urgent directions for utilization-focused evaluation are is enlarging the menu of options that we present to intended users and bringing to the fore of in the public sector, in philanthropy, in universities, in nonprofits, in businesses, the importance of looking at how any given intervention is dealing with issues of equity, sustainability, political polarization, and systems. Systems thinking going forward is going to become increasingly important. And so utilization-focused evaluation is addressing these complex systems as a different way of conceptualizing what's happening. The reason this is so important for us as evaluators to understand and think through is that evaluation has moved from a back-end activity to a front-end activity, so that we're not just evaluating programs and interventions and initiatives. We actually are involved in the front end on helping design them. So when I first started out 50 years ago, we thought evaluation was just going to be out figuring out whether or not programs were attaining their goals. And we went out and we found out they didn't have goals. In fact, they didn't have programs. So we got into the goal writing business and we got into logic modeling to help do programs. Now, as we're looking at systems change, people don't necessarily understand what systems are or how to map systems or how to transform them. So evaluators having to learn how to think in systems terms and transformation and bring issues of equity and sustainability forward become part of designing, not just evaluating, but designing interventions that take these things into account and that can be evaluated. That's the way in which we think evaluation becomes part of the solution rather than part of the problem, is to help people design for equity and sustainability and transformation and build the evaluation into those processes.
So Michael, you've got these high-level priorities, which are equity, sustainability, and what I would call harmonization between political polls, just harmonization in general. And then you've got options for your clients. How do you then use your principles to help clients choose those options?
That's the facilitation piece. And so one of the principles is to facilitate. This is a process of working with people. I've done a book on facilitating evaluation that's also principles-based, principles of facilitation that require interpersonal skills. One of the competencies that evaluators now need, that the American Evaluation Association has adopted, is the skills to help resolve conflicts among stakeholders, to help them understand what the options are, to establish priorities, and to provide them with options around methodological choices, so that they are able to understand what kind of data are going to be collected to answer the questions that they get. So there's a great deal of facilitation work involved in utilization-focused evaluation. It's not just a front-end activity where you decide what the questions are and then the evaluator picks the methods, goes out, does a study, and comes in at the end again. There's ongoing facilitation, including methods decisions. Indeed, I find the most controversial part of utilization-focused evaluation is not engaging stakeholders around determining priorities for questions. That's become well accepted in the profession. It wasn't when I started out, but there's pretty much acceptance now that there ought to be a process of engaging intended users and stakeholders around setting questions. What evaluators still object to is engaging stakeholders, non-researchers, around methods. And we argue that methods are not purely technical decisions. There are value preferences, there are evidentiary preferences. There's different kinds of credibility attached to different kinds of methods. And so part of facilitation is being able to provide intended users with a menu of methodological options, help them make those choices so that they understand what the data are going to be, they are bought into, they own the data, and that increases use rather than our telling them what to do. So all the way along. Likewise, in interpreting findings, we don't just tell them, well, here's what the data mean. It's facilitating their interpretation of the data and facilitating their drawing out conclusions about what actions to take. It's a facilitated process all the way along.
Thank you.
We had put this slide here in the end to just share one way that we have been thinking about, the implications of evaluation in the coronavirus pandemic. This was a blog published nearly 2 years ago now, so probably due for updates as well as we've learned and adapted, but to show kind of how some of this plays out in the context of the pandemic and of, adapting to context. And so I'm not going to go through it deeply because we're getting close on time, but it's been up on your screen, so hopefully you've been able to see it. I also want to, before we close, just invite you to continue the conversation with us. I'm going to put in a link here to our website. We are continuing to have webinars on the third Wednesday of each month. So March will be the next one where we dig into different parts of this book and welcome you to continue to ask questions and push our thinking and share your thinking. So wanted to be sure we get that up, and we have time for maybe a few more questions if you have them, or Michael, if you have anything else you want to add. I need to step away because I need to go pick my son up from preschool. So I'm going to say goodbye, and I'm going to leave you in the hands of Michael and John to close things out.
Thank you very much.
My greetings to Jasper.
Thank you.
I'm putting in addition to the website, I've been doing some video blogs on these issues. So I put in one on min specs. I've also done one this week on theory of transformation, what transformation is, and have created a YouTube channel where I'll be placing video blogs on not just utilization-focused evaluation, but developmental evaluation, principles-focused evaluation. I just did a blog this week on a developmental evaluation. Given the Olympics going on, I awarded my own gold medal for a retrospective developmental evaluation done by the World Food Program that is really quite excellent. And so I decided to give them a gold medal for their excellent work. And I've done a video blog on that I put the link into. So watch out for those. And if you want to subscribe to that channel, I'll be doing a lot more video blogs as we go along.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for participating in today's section. Stay tuned for the follow-up of the video recording to your various email. And be sure to join us next week when we will be joined by Dr. Donna Wanza. She's an assistant professor of psychology in evaluation at the University of Wisconsin-Scout. She'll be presenting on definitional problems in the field of evaluation, evaluation research, research on evaluation, and more. So thank you all for today's section. I appreciate your time. Have a nice day.